All right, welcome to my channel, Anglican Aesthetics. I'm really excited for this one. I have with me Dr. Taylor Patrick O'Neill. He's been on the channel before, but why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself before we get started here?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me back on. Looking forward to this. Yeah, let's see. I am technically my title's a tutor, which is what we call professors at Thomas-Aquinas College in New England, in Massachusetts. So that's where I teach, and I have written on predestination and grace and that sort of thing. I have a book with CUA Press. Called Grace, Predestination, and the Permission of Evil, a Thomistic analysis. So sort of an Augustinian Thomistic view of the problem of evil.
Yeah, great. Yeah, and I've been very helped by that book. I strongly recommend people go ahead and check that book out, and I'll link it in the description after the live stream here. But what I wanted to do in this video is sort of give a Reformed Anglican, I'm broadly sort of in the Reformed stream of Anglicanism, and Thomistic team up, responding to the problem of evil and giving a kind of robust perspective from a perspective that has a very high view of grace, a very high view of predestination, and to bring the resources of our traditions to bear on the problem of evil. So the way it gets typically articulated is that an all-good God exists. If an all-good God exists, then he would want to stop evil. He would want evil to not exist. He'd be able to stop all evil, and evil yet exists. So the claim is that there's a contradiction in these premises, particularly between premise 3, that evil exists, and premise 1, that a good God exists, with the assumption being that a good God would want to and be able to stop any evil that happens. So, Taylor, from your perspective, as you sort of hear that initial working of the problem of evil, what sort of modifications and steelmans would you sort of add to the problem, and how would you bring a Thomistic perspective to bear on responding to that form of the argument?
Yeah, I do think that this is a really difficult question. I mean, I just want to put that on the table first of all. I do think it's an incredibly difficult question, and in many ways, the argument is it certainly appears sound on the surface. So I guess I'm not surprised that it seems to be the case that so many bright people are basically moved by this argument, and it causes them to be atheist or agnostic or something like that. I think that the beginning sort of problem with the argument is in that second premise. So, but I do think that the nugget of truth is that God, if he is a good God, that God would want there not to be evil.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, in what way is it true that is it necessarily true if there are particular evils within the world, that means that creation itself is evil or disordered? And again, on the surface, it seems, I mean, the intuitive thing seems to be, well, there is clearly evil in the world. And if there's evil in the world and God could stop it, then there's something really weird going on by the fact that God has not stopped it.
Yeah.
But the second premise, sort of the way of entering into, I guess, trying to take down the argument, is to recognize that, at least from a kind of traditional Christian perspective, we have to grapple with the notion that God permits evils for the sake of some other and higher good. And if that's the case, then the argument really, the intuition behind the argument in a certain respect is upheld, but the argument as it stands falls at that point.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I would completely affirm that as well. Now, how would you respond to the atheist that says, well, any good that God could secure? So typically, you and I would want to say God permits some evil for some higher order good. And that would seem to, that seems to be what we have to say. The atheist might then say, well, any good that God could achieve by his omnipotence wouldn't require the permission of evil.
Yeah, I think that I think that just common experience can refute the notion that any good, that there's no difference regarding a good and how you get to a particular good. So, in other words, what do I mean by that? That's not very clear. What I mean is that there is certainly a difference in the good of struggling with some particular evil or some particular difficulty or obstacle, struggling, and then overcoming.
Yeah.
There's a kind of tenor to the goodness of that overcoming that is not replaced, is not one-to-one, is not the same with just not having the obstacle in the first place.
Yeah.
So even if from some kind of objective standpoint, the end result of persevering in the face of an obstacle and then overcoming the obstacle, the end result of here I am without the obstacle is the same whether I persevered or whether I was just sort of showed up like that without any obstacle and I'm without the obstacle. Even though the end result looks the same, the good that's achieved in those two scenarios is really quite different.
Yes. Yeah.
And so if God wants the universe to have goods, that there are certain goods which it seems like necessitate some kind of persevering against evil and or overcoming evil. And those goods simply would not exist in a universe in which God did not permit the evil, which is a sine qua non for those goods.
Yeah. Yeah. One analogy that often comes to my own mind is, let's say you have a soldier who's off to war and his wife deeply misses him. And he, after maybe a year or whatever on the field, comes back. They joyfully re-embrace. And that embrace, the sort of joy of that embrace is actually kind of built by the grief that preceded it. And there's a kind of unique joy in that embrace, that joy of reunion. That's different than just the joy of union as such. And so there are certain evils or certain goods that seem to almost sweep into themselves or integrate certain evils into an overarching good, sort of like the picture of the Silmarillion where Eru Iluvatar, sings that harmony over and against Melkor and resolves it, but incorporates Melkor's disharmony into it. So I think that's really helpful. Now, Schellenberg's modification is kind of interesting. And this is sort of, I think, what challenges both Reformed and Thomistic thinking. Now, I think on both of our accounts, the sort of chief end for which God created the universe is to diffuse the divine goodness, to display the sort of excellencies and characteristics of the divine nature in created things. So God is representing sort of the divine nature in creation. And in as many ways as the divine nature can be represented. Now, Schellenberg, he agrees that a theist actually has to go there because if God is the source and standard of all good, and if he seeks good, if any end he pursues, he pursues it on account of its goodness, then he has to pursue it on account of its God reflectingness, because that's what goodness is. Schellenberg's argument, and David Bentley Hart actually also, I think, makes this argument as well, is that if we say that there's some higher order good that God is pursuing in the universe, and presumably he's pursuing this good, couldn't come about any other way, which means we're saying that there's a way God is reflected in reality that couldn't come about any other way than the divine permission of evil. Schellenberg wants to say, well, if that good is modeled off of the being of God, and there's no evil in the being of God, there's sort of no constituent evil in the being of God, then there would be no version or no reason for him to instantiate the version of that good that requires evil as one of its sort of constituents. So how would you respond to that sort of argument? So he's sort of reasoning that there's an exemplar for any good that God instantiates in creation, but as it exists in God, there's no evil that constitutes that good. So why would there be evil in the version that God instantiates in creation?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting position. And I think, again, I would say that there's something to that. I mean, it's certainly true that the source of these goods that we say in some way require as a condition evil. The particular tenor of that goodness is present in God, right? The evil is not present in God. So what? But I do think that there, I would want to stress that what's being talked about here is the manifestation of these realities that are in God to the creaturely mind, to the finite and limited creaturely mind. And so while in some respect God can recognize the goodness and in some way contains, at least virtually, the good of even overcoming some evil, although there is no evil or anything lacking in God. For us to understand that, we have to participate and see God's actual overcoming of evils within creation, because only then can we see this thing which is properly in God. So creation is about manifesting, as you say, manifesting God's goodness, who God is, to created beings. And so it's really on account of a limitation in us that we require to be taught in this way. And I think that to experience, maybe there's something sort of quasi-phenomenological here or something, but to experience evil and to be beaten down by evil, and to have no recourse to your own strength whatsoever, and then to be lifted up by God, to be beaten down with despair, and then to see some beautiful tinge at the end of your despair, is really powerful, I think, to the creaturely experience. And I think I would want to argue that there's a way in which those kinds of moments manifest both the divine goodness and God's omnipotence in a way that no other experiences can. Right? That not only can God preserve us in the good, not only can God create the good, but God can take something that's become sullied and make it good. Force the evil to the good seems to indicate an even higher degree of power.
That seems right to me. And so there's sort of two thoughts that come to my own mind. You know how, so both Hans Urs and Balthasar talks about there being a prototype for the incarnation in the Father's own eternal generation of the Son, and in the Son's reception and self-return of all of that to the Father, there's the prototype of the Son's work in creation. So first, as a sort of Trinitarian thought, that in the being of God, there is a timeless kind of quasi-overcoming, and I want to be careful with that language, but there's a kind of quasi-overcoming of all emptiness, of all deficiency, insofar as in one eternal moment, the Son returns back, the Father gives all that he is to the Son, filling up all kind of lack, as it were, and the Son takes that and returns all of that to the Father. And so if there's this sort of infinite filling up of lack, which I think is sort of the prototype for the overcoming of evil in creation, such that any sort of God orders history towards displaying the divine glory by overcoming evil in one way or in another. And all overcoming of evil is in fact a sort of display of goodness filling up a kind of lack or a kind of privation. What do you think sort of about that way of reasoning from the Trinity as sort of this prototype for overcoming? And I think the nervousness in my own mind, but I'm attracted to that. The nervousness doesn't import evil into the being of God.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is such a classic question. I was reading Dennis Turner recently on the question of darkness in God, and I think that's it's kind of the same question. I mean, my hesitancy there, right, is to think about the divine nature as something that goes beyond good and evil or that sort of thing. I mean, I think that's a real problem. I guess I'm open to considering this particular theory, although I am worried about the notion that there's a kind of overcoming of a lack within ad intra, within the divine essence, which seems to necessitate that in some way lack is a part
Right.
of the
Yeah.
divine essence, or at least
Yeah.
an aspect of the divine essence. But if it's an aspect of the divine essence, it seems there's a real question about in what way then is lack just another aspect of God's fullness and not
Yeah.
something that's distinct as apart from a part.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
that's my big question. I'm more inclined to and maybe there's problems with this argument as well, but I'm more inclined to go the route of really thinking about the evil within the created order as making manifest to the creature,
Hmm.
not something that. So in other words, St. Augustine and St. Thomas, especially St. Augustine, is always talking about how evil is like the darkness in a painting that sets
Hmm.
the light into relief.
Yes. Yep. Yep.
And I think that from the perspective of the divine artist, just as from the perspective of the human artist, the light is beautiful in itself
Yep.
and is recognized as beautiful in itself. But in order to make the light which the artist sees truly manifest to the people who will gaze upon his painting, in order to make it manifest to them, he sets it in relief against the darkness.
Hmm.
And so
Hmm.
that it's by setting it in relief against the darkness, he is sharing the insight and the true vision about the light with the person viewing his art,
Hmm.
maybe more efficaciously or something like that.
Yeah.
That's so um, yeah. So I mean that's sort of my where I'm headed with this, and my initial thought is that what the darkness is doing is it's setting in relief the goodness, which does not itself require the evil in God,
Yeah.
but is nevertheless making manifest an aspect of the goodness that's in God, making it manifest to humans in a way that it could not be made manifest to us in another way.
Hmm. Hmm. So if I'm understanding that right, it would be so the way in which God manifests goodness to the creature is such that it stands out in more bright relief, just as light stands out in more bright relief against the backdrop of darkness
Yeah.
to the creature.
Yep.
And so that the creature then has a clearer apprehension of the internal excellency of God. Would that be
Yeah, that's
right?
exactly. I mean, I think I would apply this to many other things, like,
Mm.
for example, mercy, right? And we
Yeah.
know that God is
Mm.
all merciful,
Yeah.
but when God permits me to fall into some particular sin and then overcomes that with his mercy, right? That is a display of what God already was in
Mm.
himself, but now it's
Yeah.
made manifest to me. So the goodness that in God sort of comes back to the justice and the mercy that I experience as disparate aspects of God, they
Yeah.
come back to one and the same simple reality of God's goodness.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of that I agree with. I'm curious what you think about this. Would sort of be a kind of answer within the Reformed tradition, not necessarily the answer. And it's adapted from Edwards. I'm sort of modifying an Edwardsian answer here. For him, he sort of thought that, following on a very classical tradition, that goodness by its nature is diffusive. So goodness, diffuses itself in as many ways as it can in a given domain.
Yeah.
And so apart from creation, logically prior to creation, there of course is no way for goodness to diffuse itself with respect to evil, because there is no evil.
Yeah.
And so it's not a deficiency in God who is the good, that the particular ways in which the divine goodness would be displayed in overcoming evil isn't displayed,
Yeah.
because it's just metaphysically impossible.
Yeah.
But then, given the sort of domain of creation, Edwards' thought is that if we have a creation, God's way of God's goal in creation is to sort of display the divine nature, display the divine excellencies in as many ways as possible.
Yeah.
And given the reality of creation and the reality of agents that can rebel against him, there is actually a way then for God to display the divine nature, which is consonant and fitting with who he is in eternity,
Mm-hmm.
but to display it in new ways, given the reality of fallen creatures.
Yeah.
And again, that's not an augmentation of who he is, because even the new
Right.
ways are fitted to who he is from eternity. So if he enacts retributive justice on a creature, that's rooted in the fact
Yeah.
that God is more fundamentally committed to upholding the value of being,
Yeah.
But Edwards' thought then is that given the reality of creation, God intentionally ordains to permit evil in order to diffuse the divine nature in ways that it wouldn't otherwise have been diffused.
Yeah.
Well, how would that sort of strike you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. Other than, I mean, there's a few things that maybe I would quibble with. So, first of all, I mean, the good is essentially diffusive. Yes, I think that's true, but exactly what we mean by that, I think, would have to be unpacked. Because
Mm.
if it's true that the good is essentially diffusive, but diffusion requires creation, then I would say that we have a problem there.
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
So that
that's fair. Yep.
if the good is essentially diffusive, then it has to be diffusive within God in
Yes.
some way, or it's
Yeah.
not essentially diffusive, right?
Yeah.
But is only diffusive on the hypothetical, on the condition that God creates.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. The other thing I would say is that I do think it's true that God is manifesting his, I mean, obviously it's true that God is manifesting his goodness within the created order, and that in some way this is the purpose of the created order. But what's difficult is some theologians and philosophers, Leibniz is a good example. Leibniz thinks that God, I mean, he will explicitly says that God always does what's best.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, this created order is the best created order.
Mm-hmm.
Precisely because it's the one that manifests God's goodness to creatures most efficaciously, most thoroughly. And for a Thomist, I have a lot of problems with that.
Yeah.
So the difficulty is, now I have a lot of sympathies to Leibniz in a lot of ways, but there is a way in which I think the Thomist has to fundamentally state that created goods, God is not limited to create any sort of amount of created goodness.
Mm.
God, being infinitely good, is always infinitely better than any created order that he could create.
Yeah.
Therefore, there's no limitation on the amount of manifestation of goodness that God could bring about in a created order. So there's no upper limit. There's no best, at least not in the sense that Leibniz or maybe others would be talking about. So
including Edwards,
Yeah, exactly. So for St. Thomas, I mean, he explicitly will say in several places that this is not the best created order that could exist. At least in the antecedent sense. There's always room for more particular goods that could be added in.
Yeah, and those are two really good places, I think, to pinpoint Edwards as so you picked up on, because Edwards does, the modification I'm making to Edwards is that that given condition, because for Edwards, creation just is sort of the God's disposition to create is actually characteristic of his divine nature. So he thinks creation is essential, which is a departure from the broader Reformed tradition. And then secondly, he thinks this is actually the only possible world. Which is interesting, and I see why he goes there. I think you're right, though, that more classical theology, like the scholastic Reformed, like the Thomist traditions, generally speaking, wouldn't want to go there.
I will say, though, and when I said I have some sympathy for Leibniz, I will just say I think that there's a really difficult problem, I think maybe an almost intractable problem, with the question of, okay, granted that this is not that there cannot be a best possible world, at least in the antecedent sense, in the sense of you can always add in more particular goods. Like imagine just this universe. All of it's exactly the same, but I could also dunk a basketball. Okay, well, it's a little bit better, right? And so, is that not possible for God? No, of course it is. So there's no upper limit. But okay, in the consequent sense, or in the holistic sense, you might ask, well, if there are other created orders that the whole, the way everything fits together, the whole would be better than this one, then why isn't that the one that God chose? As if God were choosing, among an infinite set of possibles beforehand. That's a really I do think that's a really, really difficult question. And I do think that at least many Thomists want to say, well, almost as if it's sort of arbitrary. And I'm uncomfortable with that. But that also, though, I think that's the nugget of truth, again, just to sort of get, just to try and steel man at least a little bit. I think that's maybe something that Leibniz and Edwards or whatever
Yep.
are seeing, that you want to be able to say that it isn't just random, that this
Yep.
is the universe that we have.
Yeah.
And if there's some reason why God would prefer or God would choose this universe over infinitely other many possible universes, then you'd also want to say, well, then this is the only one that God would ever choose, because
Yeah.
there's no circumstance that might change God's mind before God creates.
Yeah.
So if you're saying, well, God always would,
Yeah.
just on account of the divine nature, make this universe,
Yep.
then you're getting pretty close. I mean, it's hard to say. You're tempted to say, well, then maybe creating just this universe
Yeah.
is pretty close to being just another aspect of the divine essence. Now,
Yep.
I don't want to go there, but I'm just saying those are really difficult questions, and so I have a lot of sympathy for someone like Edwards or Leibniz.
Yeah, that's great, and that actually is exactly Edwards's chain of reasoning. In concerning the divine decrees. So for him, it's exactly that, and he actually even takes issue with the kind of stance I hold. It's actually in some ways, from what I understand, close to a lot of Thomistic stances. Is that there are sort of a number, given God's choice to create, there are sort of a number of maximally glorifying worlds that are sort of considered as a whole equally glorifying.
Sure.
And that sort of require the same sort of ratio of permission of evil to overcoming of evil. And God just chooses one. So I am stuck with the arbitrary that God just chooses.
That is hard, and especially if you can say that there are other universes in which God could have manifested his divine essence in some way more than in this one. Then there's a real, well, why this one then? Why settle for something less? I mean, but I think at that point, this is why I say maybe it's an intractable thing, because I mean, at that point, we may be going beyond what revelation can indicate to us, right? So,
I myself am inclined to say that it's maximally glorifying with respect to the whole and with respect to everything, considering everything God has made, not any sort of given particular. But I think you're right, like that becomes a difficult problem. But with when we consider the nature of the will, Edwards's argument is, well, isn't God perfectly rational? And therefore aren't his choices always perfectly rational, and so why would he ever make an arbitrary decision? Which I get, and I'm a libertarian, so I'm okay with that.
Well, I think that's part of it, is that this discussion, this discussion arises around the time of the Enlightenment, I think, and is an ongoing thing, because theists at that time are prioritizing reason and therefore thinking of God as the supremely reasonable being. And in some ways that could stand in tension to certainly the other extreme, being the kind of radical voluntarist God of several medieval theologians. But sometimes St. Thomas sort of stands in between those two extremes in a way that can be uncomfortable, for all of us.
I agree. So one of the ways philosophers have tried to address the problem of evil that I think isn't open to either the Thomist or the Reformed is the free will defense. So typically, the free will defense pioneered by Plantinga, but in some ways he was almost reinventing Molinism without realizing he was doing it. Where for Plantinga, he thought that it could be the case that when God sees, even though we can conceive of a world in which free creatures always freely choose the good, when God sort of considers creatures, there are facts about what they would actually do if instantiated, and God can't make them do something other than what they would do, or they wouldn't be free. I understand that response. I think it has problems, and maybe we can sort of unpack some of those from. So, what would be your sort of critique of the free will defense, and then I'll give a kind of critique of it.
So I mean, I think I think there's two. I have sort of two major objections or two major critiques with the free will defense. One of them is about, the sort of the side that deals with the divine knowledge, which, as you say, is I think kind of a redressing of many aspects of Molinism and congruism. And the other one is about divine causality rather than divine knowledge. So I guess just briefly, I can lay both of those out. So the first one is this notion, again, you find this in Leibniz, interestingly enough. So I don't know, talk about a lot of Leibniz tonight, but this notion that the individual is so complete of a notion of a divine idea as to have a aseity, a kind of individual substance, which includes every single detail.
Yeah.
Right. Things that a Thomist would call every single accident about that particular life is necessitated by the idea of that particular individual.
Yeah.
Is in many ways just a very bizarre idea.
Yeah.
So it's bizarre for a number of reasons, but I would say the problem that I have most is that it really seems to limit the omnipotence of the divine will. Because if you were to say that, well, Bob, in situation X, God foresees that he will do Y, there doesn't seem to be anything about human nature as such, or even about any individual of human nature, which would make Bob doing Z in situation X rather than Y a logical impossibility. So, okay, it makes sense to say that there's things God cannot do when those things are absolutely absurd. They're not real things, right? Like a four-sided triangle is just words. But a human being taking out the trash on a random Tuesday versus not taking out the trash, those are both very thinkable, logical, possible things. But to say that even though both are thinkable and surely logically possible, God can only bring about one of the two is a really weird position to hold, I think. And also to say that we're regarding the divine will as omnipotent. And so I think ultimately the problem is it really, I don't see any way in which God does not become passive to ideas. And the divine will becomes passive to ideas. And in fact, the way that God has knowledge, and this is the sort of crux of the critique, the way then that God has knowledge about what we will do in any particular circumstance is sort of passively by knowing about us rather than knowing what he himself is doing. So God's knowledge is passive rather than active. But we're talking about God who is pure act. That's one thing. The other critique I can just say very briefly, this idea that that the human will is autonomous in some way from the divine will, that it can act, and yet somehow the divine will can be impotent in the face of human acting, is again just to state that you actually think that God is not omnipotent, in my opinion. So this idea that there are some goods that God would like us to do, but he just can't muster the strength to get us to do them, is really bizarre. And really what that amounts to is the human free will becomes a kind of hermetically sealed off aspect of creation from God's influence. But to the classical theists, the moment you hermetically seal something off from the influence of God and from even more powerfully the causality of God, it just becomes nothing. There's nothing left. So that notion of human free will as needing to be a no-fly zone for providence is, I think, ultimately absurd.
And I would agree. So I've critiqued Molinism, classical Molinism, at least before, for and pulling on there's a classic objection called the grounding objection,
Mhm.
which is how do you ground these counterfactuals of creaturely freedom?
Yep.
So presumably there are counterfactuals about what Taylor or Sean would do given certain circumstances.
Yep.
And well, like that, I'm not opposed to there being those counterfactuals
Yeah. Yeah.
in themselves.
Yep.
But the innovation of Molinism is
Mhm.
that they are both undetermined. They don't have any sort of necessary connection to God's will or God's being.
Yep.
So
Yep.
in theory, Thomas Flint says God himself could have found himself with a completely different set of counterfactuals,
Yeah.
which, if God is the source of all being external to himself, then it's kind of unthinkable
Yeah.
to imagine that the being of God would be constrained by whatever these counterfactuals are describing and
Absolutely.
sort of subject to them.
Absolutely.
And that seems to rub up against divine aseity.
Yep, I think that's absolutely correct.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
Yep. And you can, to your point, you can preserve counterfactuals of
Yeah.
creaturely freedom. So
Yeah.
I mean, if any of your listeners are really big nerds and gluttons for punishment, I had an exchange with Father Dominic Rooney
Oh, nice.
in Novit Vetera a few issues back.
Yeah.
And he was arguing that if you want to maintain counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, you're sort of necessitated to hold on to a kind of Molinist position.
Huh.
And I was arguing that no, I sort of gave, I laid out a bit about how a Banyesian, Thomist, and Augustinian would uphold counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, and really how counterfactuals of creaturely freedom are necessitated by this classical Thomistic position. It's just they're not grounded in this passive notion that God already comes loaded with regarding who you are, who I am.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, and I think that's right. I'll link if you want to send that article to me.
Sure.
I can link it below.
Sure.
And I'd also suggest I have an article in the Haythrop Journal as well that I'll link below for the viewers as well. So then the alternative. So it would seem then, at least to my mind, and I fully embrace this, that when we consider something like the fall, I don't appeal to the answer, well, God, even though it's true for the sake of moral culpability that Adam has free will and that God doesn't sort of infuse evil into him, like that's true. Nevertheless, I don't appeal to this idea that God couldn't have stopped Adam from eating from the tree of knowledge without violating his freedom. I don't think that's true.
Yep.
And so in that case, then, when the person who says, if we bite that bullet, and let's say you have a mother who's, I'm actually going to put this comment on the screen because I think it's really good. So the most visceral problem of evil scenario I've seen is from Ivan and the brothers Karamazov. So that scene where he's like, it's not worth the death of one girl, right? So we think about the person who brutalizes a young girl, and the young girl dies, and our positions would hold that it wasn't that God, that person's free will sort of hermetically sealed them as an agent away from God. So in that sense, God really could have stopped them and chose not to.
Yep.
What resources are sort of available to our positions then for thinking about why God might permit an evil like that, given that we can't appeal to sort of the preservation of free will at that point?
Yeah. I mean, that's the $1 million question, right? I think there's a number of things. What's really interesting about what Ivan Karamazov says is he doesn't say that he disagrees with the notion that out of some permitted evil, God could bring an even higher good.
Mm-hmm.
What he says is that he is uninterested in the higher good if it costs that evil.
Yeah.
He says, I return my ticket, basically, if that's the price.
Yeah.
And so how do you argue against that? I mean, my sort of thought there is, really, that's not even so much a philosophical or theological error that Ivan Karamazov is making, but really it's a kind of, ultimately is a theological error, of course, but really it's rooted in a kind of lack of imagination and or a lack of trust in the power of God.
Yeah.
So I do think that at the end of the day, sort of the ultimate answer to the question, well, why would God permit any particular evil, even major evils, things like the Holocaust?
Yeah.
And then, of course, the big question is not just evils that are eventually temporally overcome, but some evils, if indeed there are some sinners who are damned and remain so for all eternity, there seems to be certain particular evils that aren't even overcome. They just continue to persist.
Yep.
Why would God do all of that? Well, there must be a kind of recognition of and a kind of trust in divine providence and in the absolute power of God to do things that we can't even begin to imagine now.
Yeah.
Things that, again, I've used this analogy before, but I mean, we've had experiences like this. You may be reading a novel or you're watching a movie or something, and halfway through, something really terrible happens, and you just go, oh, this ruined the whole thing. I mean, it's just nothing could make this better. It's just done.
Yeah.
And then through some genius of the writer, by the end of the story, it not only is it made better, but you can see how the terrible thing that happened in the middle is what allows for the great resolution and beauty at the end.
Yeah.
And so in a way that we have to just kind of have a hopeful expectation and trust.
Yeah.
And I think that's a disposition that the problem of evil necessitates in those who are willing and able to follow the problem to its natural conclusion. So in other words, I think my biggest problem with a number of other positions, whether it's the free will defense or on the other side of things, sort of necessary universalism, David Bentley Hart.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, both of these, they kind of, what they say they're doing and what they would be doing if they were correct is solving the problem of evil. But I guess what I'm arguing for is a reverence before the problem of evil, a kind of attempt, an Anselmian attempt to understand as much as we can. But if it's true that evil has a place within the created order, we can't expect to understand its place until we see the whole of the created order.
Yeah. Yep.
So for now, we should expect not to be able to solve the problem of evil and put it up in a nice little, tie it up with a nice little bow and set it on the table and go, look, I've done it. I've finished it. And any position which claims to have done that should send up alarm bells for the wayfaring Christian, right?
Yep. Yeah. I'm going to put up this comment and then also add a couple of 2 cents because I don't think this is what you're doing, but this user says Noob Slaya 6 says seems like a cop-out reply from Taylor here. You can't just hand wave away people's disgust at tragedies as a lack of trust. If anything, it displays a greater trust we expect from a lot from him. And I would say, and Taylor, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think you're hand waving away people's disgust. Like people's disgust at tragedy is still completely legitimate in an analogous way to how if I hear disharmony, like I'm going to experience that as disharmonious. And that's a true experience of that event. But it's rather to say that the judgment that there is no possible good that even an omnipotent God could bring out of it is a presumptuous judgment. And I know that's hard because like we often you don't necessarily, and pastorally, that's not the first thing you want to say to a grieving mother.
Absolutely.
So that would be way down the line, if at all, probably with her priest or her presbyter or whoever. That wouldn't. But that said, if we judge from any given evil that because I cannot imagine a good that God could permit that would justify this, that therefore there is no good that God could permit that would justify this. That is to project my view of reality, my the slice of reality I see onto the whole. And it would be sort of like the person who's only looking at a bit of a tapestry with a microscope, saying there's no way this could form a bigger harmonious pattern. It would be the exact same epistemic position.
Yeah, and I think that this is not unrelated from the way in which God is teaching us
Yeah.
spiritually.
Yep.
So I mean, could it be the case? Could it be the case that each one of us is called to have to struggle with some evil, maybe a number of evils, maybe one particular evil, and to sit there and to look at it and to think, I just do not see how is this going to be good? How is this going to be worth it in the end? I just do not see. And maybe it's not an evil for you. Maybe it's an evil for a loved one. I mean, surely, right? I mean, I just don't see. I just don't get it. Well, maybe not getting it and not being able to see as a wayfarer. I mean, this is part of learning how to abandon ourselves and
Yeah.
trust fully in God.
Yeah.
And if abandoning ourselves and trusting fully in God is actually absolutely necessary to arrive at communion with God in paradise,
Yeah.
then this would be not only this would not only be a way of manifesting God's goodness, but this would be a kind of necessary probedeutic in the spiritual life, a necessary truth, a necessary purgative aspect of living out the spiritual life.
Yeah.
And it seems to me, I mean, it seems hard to argue against that all of us are faced with difficulties and we cannot see the light at the end of the tunnel and have to give all of our trust over to God in regard to that.
Yeah. And I think that's right. And importantly, the analog here, so there's kind of a follow-up here. Like, I don't think music or tapestries can be compared to the Holocaust in good faith. The analog here isn't that the Holocaust is just a kind of minor disharmony in a sense. Like, that's not the point. The point is that just as we can see in a narrative, there might be some event that happens in a narrative that's so horrible, and we can't see how a resolution could make it worth it. But then a resolution happens that does through the genius of a writer, or like a disharmony happens in a symphony, and we sort of say, this is grating. I don't see how this can be integrated into the whole. And the genius of a composer resolves it such that it is. Much more could we expect that God, who's underwriting all of history, could do that. So the analog is not to trivialize the Holocaust, but to say, just like a good can be wrought from these disharmonies, or a narratival good can be wrought from narrative disharmony, so we could expect the divine author to be able to do the same as he underwrites history in his product.
And trivializing something like the Holocaust just limits the manifestation of the divine goodness that we're talking about, right? So the Holocaust is a perfect example of something which is absolutely horrific. And I have absolutely no notion in my mind about how God is going to sort of order that to the good.
Sorry, my dog typically joins these videos.
Sure, no, that's great. But yet, right, all I can do is trust and have hope that something that seems inconceivable to me is actually conceivable to God. And this is where, I mean, Julian of Norwich, I think, is excellent on this, the great mystic on the problem of evil. But she just says, at the end, God will perform the great deed.
Yeah.
Whatever the great deed is, maybe it's the whole of creation. But at the end, the great deed will sort of, as if by magic, turn all the evil things into gold.
Yeah.
And I have no notion as to what that would even be, how that could be possible, right? So you are left with a kind of, you're required to stand in a disposition of abandonment to God.
Yeah.
But I guess what I'm arguing is that's a good thing.
Yeah. Well, and we kind of have an icon of this in the Passion. So that Christ is crucified, the disciples then are in the position, because if your Messiah was killed, this, in every other messianic movement, this was a sign that the person wasn't the Messiah.
Exactly.
Is why the Bar Kokhba revolt, disintegrates and such.
Yeah.
So they can't imagine, like they see Jesus crucified and they think it's over. Like we need to hide. Like it is, we had thought he was the one to redeem Israel, as the disciples on the road to Emmaus say, with the implication being he wasn't, right? But the disciples could not imagine the resurrection coming. And as Christian, like I look at the resurrection and I'm like, oh, like that really does make it worth it. That transforms the meaning of the cross. Like if Jesus didn't rise, the cross is just a tragedy. It's just the slaying of a man. If he did rise, that gives the cross meaning in the context of his resurrection.
Yeah.
Now, I'm curious how you would respond to it. So Alex O'Connor, he's kind of a popular YouTube atheist, and he's a very thoughtful person. His objection to this sort of response is to say, well, if you go that route, then wouldn't you have to say, well, thank God that the Holocaust happened? Like that wouldn't you have to then say, well, then wouldn't this put the Christian in the position of saying, well, yeah, it was a good thing that the Holocaust happened, even if they're not saying the Holocaust is good.
Yeah, I mean, sure, in a certain respect, but that just, to me, that just feels like a kind of a gotcha question and not a real sort of exploration of the position. What I mean by that is you have to, this position requires that you delineate between the evil of a particular thing and the good that can come out of a particular evil. And we do this all of the time, I think, on the natural level. So you don't become a sort of a moral monster by saying, man, this bad thing that happened to me 10 years ago, whatever it is. You hear people say this all the time, like, I became addicted to drugs, and I reached a low point in my life. But if I had not reached that low point in my life, I would not have found Christ, or I would not have realized the love that my parents have for me, or whatever, right? And so in a certain respect, people will say, well, boy, that was awful. And of itself, it was terrible and evil. But also, thank God. Thank God for the goods, and thank God for the evils that I have experienced. Right? So in both cases, blessed be the name of the Lord. Why? Because God is always ordering all things to the good. So if that's the gotcha, if the gotcha is, oh, really? God's ordering all things to the good, even the Holocaust, then yes, that's fine. I will fully go on the line and say that's precisely what I'm saying. And that's the reason I'm a Christian. That's why I have hope. Because I trust that God, otherwise, either God is incapable, and this just goes back to the things that we've been talking about earlier, but either God is incapable of stopping the Holocaust, in which case he's not God,
right?
Or what, he's just allowing it. Why?
Arbitrarily.
Arbitrarily? Well, that's worse. That's much worse. So sure, yes, absolutely. I think we all look on the resurrected body of Christ. We see and we glorify his wounds. Which are evil in themselves. In themselves, these are marks of evil and the result of evil. And yet they take on this entirely new light, given the whole of salvation history. And everything that is evil in salvation history will become tinged with the light.
That's great. And so to give kind of an example, and I won't go into too much detail about this, but like my brothers and I had a kind of difficult childhood. And when I look back on that childhood, yes, it was sad in a lot of ways. But I do thank God for it. And I don't think that makes me like a sociopath. Because there were certain ways in which God was forming me that actually couldn't have come about any other way. And there were certain kinds of endurances I have now as a result of that I wouldn't have otherwise had. So I don't, I think it's good that those goods came about, even though I can say of that evil and that abuse that it was bad in and of itself. Considered.
Exactly. And happy fault. I mean, this is a part of the tradition, right? So
and there's a follow-up here. So I think Alex's point is the classic atheist one. This ordering could have been achieved without suffering. Man was originally made without sin. So why did we have to take this route to go back to how it was? So importantly, for the reasons we were talking about, so we were just discussing how the permission of evil is permitted unto goods that actually couldn't have come about any other way.
Yeah.
So for instance, and we can think of kinds of goods, right? We have a category of goods that are uniquely forged in the fires of suffering. So for instance, bravery, right? Bravery is a good. And typically when I make this point, sometimes I found that people sometimes are like, oh, you're saying that God permits rape for bravery. And that's not what I'm saying. I'm using an analogy here.
Yeah.
Bravery is a good that requires the permission of evil, because bravery is courage in the face of evil. And so we're saying we have a class of goods that require the permission of evil as their condition for overcoming that evil. And in the same way, there's a class of goods that God is seeking to instantiate, namely ways the divine nature is instantiated, such that they wouldn't otherwise come about apart from the permission of evil, like God's overcoming of death, like we say Felix culpa, happy fault, because we think that the resurrection of Jesus is actually a tremendous display of love. The death and resurrection of Jesus, and of course, it wouldn't have come about without its presupposition, which is sin.
Yep, absolutely.
So I don't know if you have any thoughts to that.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I do think it's worth stating, too, that it isn't the case that, at least from the sort of classical Augustinian Thomistic view of things, that we are sort of going just back to Eden.
Yes.
I mean, if that were true, then I agree there would be a kind of absurdity and like, oh, well, let's allow some evil just to get back to where we started. But actually, the position is, we start at a kind of place of good standing with God, but not standing with God. We stand to God still as a sort of as a good servant, as a good creature. And we fall even further away from God, and we fall into rebellion from God. But that is the thing which allows and brings about the very incarnation of Christ. And the end point of that is infinitely higher than Eden. The end point of that is not to go back to being a faithful servant, but to become a friend of God. To see the divine essence and to enter, as C.S. Lewis puts it, to enter into the divine dance of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. And that's infinitely more than what Adam and Eve had in the garden. And so that's the Felix culpa. This is sin occasioned this manifestation of God's goodness and benevolence to us, and even manifesting to us God's goodness that goes all the way to suffering death, the cruelest death. How would we understand God's love? Would we understand what love is, to love the other more than yourself, even to denying yourself all goods, including the good of life? Would we understand that that's what divine love is if we didn't have sin? I don't think so.
I think that's right. And certainly the sort of display of God's love in that way wouldn't have come about any other way.
Right.
That's really good. So then pivoting to Luis Oliveira. I don't know if you're familiar with Oliveira's work.
No, I'm not.
Or I don't know if there's a day. I think it's just Oliveira. But so he's a philosopher. I forget where he teaches. But he recently published an article in the International Journal for Philosophy of Religion, trying to argue that, okay, like this is and he's targeting this sort of response. And he says, if you say that God has a good reason to permit any sort of given evil, it leads to moral paralysis in the following way. Namely that we as humans agree, and he would agree with this principle, that if there is a sufficient good, that justifies the permission of a given evil, that one can't be held accountable for stopping a given evil if there's some sort of good that comes about that justifies it and couldn't have come about in a different way. And then he says, well, the theist in the architecture and the way they sort of experience and encounter the world has at their disposal the belief that God, any evil that happens permitted by God, is permitted for a good reason. So he argues then that wouldn't that give the theist a kind of reason to be inactive in the face of evil, to not oppose any evil, because the theist always does have a legitimate reason to think that the occurrence of this evil will bring about a higher order good.
Yeah. Well, okay, so let me ask, just as a point of clarification, is he saying that the theist is arrested morally because they have faith that God will bring about a higher good? Or okay, I see. Yeah, so okay, but that's just to, I think, miss the entire notion of divine and human causality that's sort of at the heart of this position, which is to see the divine cause as the primary cause and the human cause as the necessary secondary, or you might say instrumental cause or something.
Yep.
So I think this is a common error, but a really fundamental one, to think that the way that God acts in the providential order is in some sense still not through us. Because if we think about ourselves as doing good in some particular circumstance, we see that as maybe acting against the providential ordering that God's already effecting.
Yeah.
But again, that's already to start off on the wrong foot and to have a kind of competitive view between the divine will and the human will, which is the very opposite of where this position, sort of the basic starting principle of this position, which is that God is affecting the providential order, the exact one that he wants, in and through our own free choosing of the good that God commands us to do. So, okay, maybe it's true after I sin that I say, oh, well, I guess that's part of the ordering that God has ordained, and that will have some good involved in it. But I don't know what the ordering is beforehand. And all I know is that God commands me to do the good, and it's actually still really bad when I don't do the good. It's not overthrowing the divine will, but in itself, it's still an evil. So I am still commanded. I mean, St. Augustine, right? St. Augustine's very clear. Just because the divine providence is infallible does not mean that you should all of a sudden throw up your hands. This was the era of the Quietists that sort of came about during the time of Jansen. And maybe ironically, the problem with the Quietists is that they're kind of sort of presupposing a quasi-competitive notion of the divine and human will, which is completely contradicting the very heart of even Jansen's notion of grace and human freedom.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And building off of that, then, if there isn't competition between divine providence and the human will, then whenever I stop a given evil, that would be a revelation of God's purposes. So if I act to save someone who I could save, that would be a revelation of the fact that God thought it better not to permit that evil.
Absolutely.
And therefore, the consideration of providence doesn't give me more reason to permit evil than to stop it.
No, absolutely not.
And so, so I've made this argument in a new Blackfriars article, where, like, if we just consider that level, the level of providence, it seems like a pretty intuitive moral principle to my mind that if you're at a place in your moral reasoning where you reach this state of parity, right, you have equal reasons to permit an evil as to oppose it. So you reach that place. Well, then that parity itself should become a reason to act against evil. Because if all things being equal, you have just as much reason to permit an evil as you do to oppose it, then you should oppose it. And I think that's just a baseline. Like that seems intuitive, at least to me. But then secondly, God seems to have designed us to reflect him in a particular way and to a particular end, and namely to reflect the ways in which God is actually working against evil in the world. So he's designed humans to reflect some of his attributes, not all of his attributes. And therefore, we flourish when we actually reflect God in accordance with the specifications of our nature, and the specifications of our nature are revealed in God's commands.
Yeah.
And so both of those, it would seem to me, diffuse that kind of argument that Holy Father raises.
Absolutely. I think that's totally true. So yeah, if the objection is basically, well, what about quietism? Well, yeah, I would just say, okay, well, that's whatever. I mean, there's another objection that I actually think is somewhat forceful, which is to say that, well, if God is revealing to us this kind of, sometimes God permits evils and sometimes he doesn't, then that becomes a kind of exemplar for human. So not about trusting in God, but it just becomes a kind of exemplar. Yep. And again, there, I think that just totally misses the infinite disparity between what God is doing by creating and governing and what men are doing by being creatures. There's an infinite distance. And this is why Father Brian Davis has written a really great book about God and evil. And one of the things that he argues, which on the surface sounds really bad, like we're just being voluntarists, but what he's arguing is that God is not a moral agent. And what he does not mean that, oh, well, basically what's good is just whatever God wills, but God could will anything, kind of radical voluntarism. But instead, what he's saying is that human beings are moral because we have all sorts of obligations. Like we are a bundle of obligations to ourselves, to lower beings, to higher beings, etc. But God is radically transcendent from the created order. So he's not a moral agent like that with bundled up all of these obligations to other things. So anyways, that's just another aspect of this that I think someone could miss.
Yeah, and that's actually really important. So tell me if this sort of fleshes out that idea. What to be a creature is to have our being totally conditioned by both God's creative act and the context in which he's created us. Like we don't get to just sort of decide what natures we have. And so God's created us with a given nature in a given context to actually play a certain part in reflecting him, which means I can't try to grab a part that God has reserved for himself and say, okay, well, this is mine, because my nature wasn't actually made in the context in which I'm embedded to reflect God in that way. It's only made to reflect God in certain ways and to let God be God in other ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Creatures, by definition, are radically contingent. And God, by definition, is radically autonomous. He is radically transcendent. And so, I mean, so many errors in theology come about just by not recognizing that God truly is transcendent, right? And so when you don't recognize that, then you fall into some kind of, not moral, but some kind of philosophical or theological idolatry, right? God becomes a really big, powerful thing, but nevertheless a thing, another part of the created order.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So then I don't know what your time looks like.
I'm good with whatever.
Okay,
if you want to go for a little bit more, that's fine.
Yeah, great. So then moving on then to animal suffering. So that's sort of another dimension of the problem of evil that gets raised. And that has been getting raised a lot I feel like in the past 10 years or so. There's been a lot of writing on animal suffering. And there are really a lot of different ways of articulating the problem, depending on how you think animal suffering is related to Eden. So if you think that it's an aberration, that there's something wrong with the way animals are predatory towards each other, that doesn't take away the problem, but it changes how you address it. If you think it's part of the created order, then that's also going to change things. I know in the Reformed tradition, you have, from what I understand at the Sacra Doctrina project that over the summer, a good amount, probably even most Thomists, would want to say that like predation, and this was before even before evolution, before Darwin's theory, Thomists and Augustinians and many church fathers actually were saying that predation is part of Eden.
Which is
at
the very least, it's natural, right?
Yes.
Maybe in Eden on account of man or something.
Mm, mm,
Maybe animals weren't preying on each other, but
yeah.
certainly outside of Eden or in the natural world, yeah, they're this is just what animals do.
Yeah. Yep. And that was helpful for me because there were quite a few. I didn't know that was as widespread as it was.
Yeah.
So which was really interesting. There with the Reformed tradition, I've since found out that there are people who go both ways. So there are some Reformed theologians that do go that way and say that it's just part of the natural world. And then there are some that think the fall kind of wrecked the created order.
Yeah.
So how would you so to state the objection, and then maybe we can sort of target it from both of our perspectives. The objection would be that the suffering in the natural world seems extreme.
Yeah.
So there, Komodo dragon ripping up a deer,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
chomping on the deer. I'll never forget whose answer when I asked the question, like the Komodo dragon's like tearing Bambi out of the womb and eats Bambi and eats the mother. Like, is that part of God's good will? I'll never forget him saying yes.
Yeah.
It's striking. But I
Yeah.
mean, maybe I guess.
Well, it sounds harsh. Yeah.
Yeah.
Look, this is where so I think it's, you see it in you see it in a lot of places. You see it in St. Augustine, you see it in St. Thomas, you see it in several church fathers, St. Athanasius, many places. This notion that humanity itself is naturally mortal and is upheld from death only by a preternatural gift of grace, which is above nature. Okay, well, if that's true, then it's not a far jump to argue that it's animality itself which is mortal. And animals seem ordered by their very nature to prey upon other animals. And so St. Thomas is explicit. I mean, he says, it is not true that hawks did not prey on hares or whatever before the fall. That's just what they do. That's not on account of sin.
Yeah.
Okay, so if that's true, in some ways that's a difficult thing to take in, because it means that God made things to be this way, and this is the way things are supposed to be.
Yeah.
So there, I think I would say a couple of things. I would say it's still true that this distinction between the antecedent and the consequent will maintains. You see it in St. John Damascene, you see it in St. Thomas Aquinas. In regard to the particular life, even of the rabbit that's eaten by the hawk, there is still a way in which God wills for the life of every creature. If that thing were considered in isolation from the rest of the created order, God would will every good to it that's natural to it. However, on account of its place within the whole created order, God does allow, however you want to put it, the hawk to eat the rabbit. Now, why is that not a problem? Well, I would say it's not a problem for several reasons. One, the good of the created order is not just an aggregate of individual particular goods. So, in other words, it's not as if the good of the created order is diminished when a rabbit dies from being eaten by a hawk, because although the private good of that rabbit is lost, the rabbit is still contributing to the common good of the whole created order. The other thing is, this is a very different thing. I think we honestly we don't really know what we're talking about when we talk about animal suffering. Now, I'm not saying that animals don't suffer. I'm not saying that they don't feel real suffering, but we are so formed by the human experience, and especially by the anxiety, the self-awareness of suffering, knowing what it means, all of these things, that I just don't think we can wrap our imagination around what it means to suffer as a rabbit. And so I just, not knowing at all not even having a clue or an inkling about what that experience would be like, it's really difficult to sort of have a conversation about whether that happens too much or too widely, if that makes sense.
Yeah. That's interesting. There's a comment here, and so in defense, so I thought death entered into the world through sin. Did I? So in defense of the position Taylor's sketching here, and I would actually agree with this reading of Romans 5. I think Paul's talking about human death there. So humans have access to the tree of life, and I actually agree humans are created mortal, and that's why the tree of life is there.
Yeah.
It's there as a Calvin actually calls it kind of a sacrament of
Exactly.
God's sustaining their life.
St. Augustine says that. Yeah.
Which makes sense. Yeah, he's probably pulling on Augustine. So humans, I would agree, are mortal, and human death is what Paul's talking about in Romans 5.
Yeah.
Now, here would be sort of the perspective I tentatively hold to myself. My own view of the matter is that Genesis 1 represents the sort of ideal and the design of the world, but then in the development of species, so where species are actually sort of envisioned as, I'm not a young earth creationist. I do think Genesis 1 is sort of with Augustine's view is basically where I settle. Now, but I would say it's describing the sort of natural teleology of creatures. But then in their development, it's interesting that Satan is in the garden in Genesis 3, prior to the fall. So on my sort of telling, and I'm pulling some of this from Lewis, I think it's and I know this answer gets disparaged in the academy. I think it's more plausible if you think consciousness is irreducible. So I mean, I can do a whole thing. But I do actually think the development of species was plausibly corrupted at some point. So that why do mosquitoes suck blood? I think the trajectory of their development plausibly was corrupted. And same with, it's sort of Tolkien on orcs being corrupted elves. Mosquitoes are corrupted whatever. I don't know, maybe fairies or something. I have no idea. That's sort of the perspective where I land, though I recognize your position has a lot of patristic support. Which does make me like more hesitant. How would you?
I think that's a tenable position. I mean, I think part of this is maybe just, I don't know. Maybe, I mean, part of it is coming this from a particularly Thomistic stance, right? You just sort of you're very comfortable with saying that matter is of itself always corrupting. That this is what makes matter, and this is what matter does. So there has to be something that is miraculous or quasi-miraculous for matter not to do what matter does, to corrupt. And so if what matter does is corrupt, it moves around, really. It dissolves, right? Things come together, and then the underlying thing that makes it to be this kind of a thing or that kind of a thing, it just sort of dissolves again and goes into a different form. And this is what differentiates the world down here, which is constantly in flux. Heraclitus sort of recognized this constant flux and change that's going on from the world of the eternal, from the heavens, which is unchanging and immobile, right? So, that means that things are constantly in flux down here, and things are constantly bumping into each other. And when things bump into each other, they act on each other. And sometimes they act on each other in a way that's beneficial to one and not to the other, or sometimes they both are not beneficial to each other. So if hawks prey on rabbits just by nature, I don't, to me, it makes all the sense in the world to think that, then mosquitoes prey on men by nature. This is just the way things are. This is part of the glory and the struggle of having a human body. This is part of the weird experience of both being destined for immortality, being called to commune with God himself, and yet also having my blood sucked by some little insect. It's a very weird thing to be a human being. To be this weird mesh of spirit and body is really weird, but having the body means having to deal with the same body problems that the hare deals with in being eaten by the hawk. I could
Yeah.
get eaten by a bear, like that's a
Yeah.
weird way to go
Yeah.
for something that is in a way ontologically of infinitely higher dignity than a
Yeah.
bear. But I mean, that's part of the weird experience of being a human being, it seems to me.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really interesting. And that definitely, and again, there are Reformed theologians that go that way, and they add that perhaps God represents some of his attributes in the lion eating the sheep. So there's something
Yeah.
of the ferocity of God manifest.
Yeah.
And I'm
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
I see that. There
Yeah.
is something about that still rubs me
Yeah.
God still created that as as a creature that experiences pain,
Yeah.
I suppose if the creature blacked out, or something like that, I wouldn't have as much of a problem with it.
Yeah.
So if there was no experience of pain, so maybe that's where the real rub is for me.
Yeah. Well, I don't think we really have any notion of what the conscious experience of pain is like for a creature which is in a whole different order of being than we are. So,
yeah, that's okay. That's really, that's interesting. So that would change. So for you, then there's a different sort of axiology there. Whereas for me, it just kind of reduces to the problem of the problem of moral evil, because it's the problem of spiritual agents corrupting the development of species.
Right. I mean, there's still a question of natural evil here, because it's not part of the moral question.
Right.
Yeah, it's kind of a standalone thing in a way.
Yeah. So then moving to the question actually then of natural evil, it's often stated as God created an environment where it seems like the teleology of the geological structures of the earth are such that they cause earthquakes naturally. They cause tornadoes and hurricanes, and those things destroy and kill. How would a sort of Thomist frame thinking about natural evil such that it wouldn't be the case that God merely sort of permitted hurricanes, but that he sort of created the teleological structures in which these things are generated?
So it's such a good question. I think I would say a number of things here. So on the one hand, natural evils are not part of the question of moral evil, insofar as natural evils are not the result of some decay within the order in which God created the world. Nevertheless, this goes back to the sort of weirdness of human nature, especially from a Thomistic perspective. Nevertheless, there's kind of something ill-fitting in the soul being separated from the body on account of the weakness of the body as material. So although the preternatural gifts of immortality and other things, integrity, although those are in a certain respect above nature, they're very fitting for the nature. And there's a way in which man being subject to the natural element of his nature, which is death, is also, it's natural, but it's also ill-fitting. Which is a really, I mean, that's a whole, separate thing of talking about how, what that would mean for something to be natural but ill-fitting. But that seems to be what's going on with human nature, and especially the dissolution of the body and its separation from the soul. So, okay, what does that mean? That means that mankind is must have been protected from, well, things like being preyed upon by bears, but also being killed in a tornado or whatever in Eden. Not because he was not naturally subject to death, but because it was fitting that the state in which he was created ensured that the body was always serving the soul. Okay, so that means that in a certain respect, these natural evils, or at least the fact that we are subject to them, is part of a moral question. It's part of the question of salvation history and all of that. Okay, so then we do experience these things as the result of evil, not because nature has been lost, but because, or not because an aspect of nature has been lost, but because an aspect of grace has been lost. So these things are always in some way penal on account of that. But that doesn't mean that everyone who gets killed in a natural disaster is of themselves sort of personally guilty for some sin, and this is their divine punishment.
Yeah.
Okay, so God then is causing things to happen within the natural order which bring about the death of a person, although he may not sort of actively be willing the death of that person. Nevertheless, he's permitting this phenomenon that he has actively caused to bring about the death of a person. Okay, why would he do that? Well, the answer to that, I think, is the same thing as why God permits other moral evils. The answer is that these particular evils, in some mysterious way that we cannot yet see, contribute to the good of the common order, the whole order. And we will not be able to see and understand that until the end of all things. So I have a very good friend who lost a child when the child was very young. And this was a tremendous hardship for him. And yet I know that he believes that the loss of this child, which was brought about by disease, not by a moral evil, nevertheless, there's some reason for it, right? And that takes, so much trust that I can't even imagine.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, I think that's the perspective that the Christian has to have in the face of these natural evils. Why did I lose a loved one to cancer?
Yeah.
I don't know, but there is a reason.
Yeah.
There's a way in which it will all be right in the end, that God is working all things to the good. And that's true of moral evils, and it's equally true of natural evil.
Yeah. And I think that's right. And I'd add to that there's nothing, if you think about like the eruption of a volcano or a tornado, there's nothing evil about the eruption of a tornado or of a volcano or a tornado in themselves, right?
Yeah, right.
Like what makes it evil or sad is when it causes suffering or death. And if we think, which I think we should, that minimally with humans, which I think all of us agree, that the way God designed humans was such that in the garden, in sort of participating in the tree of life, they wouldn't have been subject to these things. Then we can't say it's sort of part of God's design for people, such that people were subject to cancer or subject to, death and disease or things like that. Now with, people will then often point to animals. I think you'd have then the similar sort of moves made earlier, depending on whether you think animal death and predation were part of the natural structure of the world. So Taylor would represent a stream that would say yes. My own position would represent a stream that says no, but with sort of spiritual corruption. I think that's. Am I missing anything in that summary there?
No, I don't think so. Okay. I think that sounds about right. And again, these things are, you might even argue that these are necessary for the kind of spiritual disposition that we are required to have. So in other words, like, we are supposed to constantly be ready for our own death.
Yeah.
Why? Well, not just because of moral evils, not just because someone might kill me, but because if much more common natural evils. I mean, who knows? The earthquake could happen and I could die. I could have a heart attack tomorrow. You never know, right? And that's purposeful. That's purposeful so that we are not lukewarm, so that every moment we have a good reason to be. it's a way in which every moment can, if we allow it, be a reminder that we are radically contingent upon God.
Yes. Yep.
And that is constantly true and obvious to us. That's made manifest by the fact that we know that at any moment we could die by anything.
Yeah.
And so we need
Yep.
to be ready, because the end, not just the end of all things, but the end for me or you can come like a thief in the night. For many
Yeah.
people it does, right?
Yeah. Yep.
So that's just, again, part of the human experience.
Yeah. 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 That's great. That's right. Yeah. Okay. Let me think. I don't think I'm trying to see if I missed anything here. Yeah, I don't think so. Okay, great. Well, so then we'll end with Q&A, and then we'll wrap up. Does anyone have any questions that they want to ask? And meanwhile, I'll kind of scroll through some of the comments here. Actually, it seems like we address them on the way. Okay. Well, great. If no one has any additional comments, do you have any sort of last thoughts, any sort of last reflections on how we should think about the problem of evil as Christians, and how we can use sort of what some of the things we've been talking about here pastorally, both in our lives and the lives of others around us?
Yeah, I think, I guess, I just have two things I'll say briefly. I do think that anyone who finds, the traditional Augustinian Thomistic or whatever Reformed position on this to be, not very convincing. I mean, I understand. There's all sorts of things about all of these positions that are difficult, right? And there's just difficult aspects of reality that theology sort of struggles to answer properly. I do think that if someone looks into the other possible positions here, whether it's the free will defense or sort of necessary universalism, you will also see real issues, right?
Yeah.
So, I think what we're trying to do is we're trying to answer the question as best as we can and look at the possible positions before us and to see which one seems most consistent with Scripture and with reason and things like that. And I guess my position is that this is the position that is most consistent with Scripture and reason, even if it still leaves really difficult questions, even if it still leaves you feeling uneasy at times. The other thing, as far as like a pastoral import, I mean, boy, I think the pastoral import of all of this is huge, because what this means is that evil, both moral evil and natural evil, not only are they not beyond the power of God to order them to the good, but we already know that God is ordering them to the good. And I think that this position is a real sort of font of hope for the Christian, because as Julian of Norwich puts it, no matter what happens, no matter what evil we experience, we already know that God is moving all things to the good, and therefore all shall be well. All manner of things shall be well.
Yeah.
We don't know how that's going to happen, but we know that it is happening now. Yeah. God is in complete and utter control, and God is making everything good. Every bad thing that's happening is going to be made good in the end. It's going to be made all right in the end. And all we have to do is just wait and trust.
Yeah.
And I think that's an immensely powerful message. And I honestly, I really struggle to see how that's not the only message
that can
be given
to
anyone facing evil. All of the other positions, the other sort of speculative theological positions, I think they neuter your ability to say God is in control.
Yeah.
And ultimately, isn't that the most comforting thing? I mean, I think, right?
Yeah. I would agree with that. Someone just asked a question. If you want to,
are there any particular responses to divine hiddenness?
Yeah,
boy, it's a really great question. I do think that it seems to be the case that although God and the human will are in no way competitive, it is true that what it is to be a human being is to learn primarily by sensing the world around us and then abstracting things from what we sense and discursively reasoning through them. So, what that means is that, kind of by the very nature that God creates us with, God is hidden.
Mm.
Yet, I would say that that's not like that's just a particularity of our creatureliness. I mean, in a certain way, I think all creatureliness is to be so removed from who God is in himself that God would appear to be hidden in some way.
Mm.
Right. But okay, in a particular way for us, though, because we are bodily and because we learn through our senses, it is difficult for us to have knowledge of God. It is difficult for us in a natural mode to think about God and to know about God. Now, it's true that God did speak to us directly in the garden, but that was lost on account of sin.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
And, okay, losing that on account of sin is an evil in itself, but seems to be ultimately a good for us in the long run. And some of that, I think, at least some of that is illustrated in the Gospels when Christ says, "Blessed are you who see and hear me, but much more blessed are those who do not, and yet who trust," right?
Yeah.
Who have trust. So our love of God increases in a way the more that we place our trust into him. Yeah. And it's the love of God that is the most important thing in the creature and allows the creature to commune with God when all of this is said and done.
Yeah.
And so that trust is occasioned in some way by divine hiddenness.
Yes. Yeah.
But the divine hiddenness is also, as I say, it's on our side in many, many ways.
Yeah.
If we could just see things rightly, we'd be smacked in the face by the presence of God everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
And maybe that's what heaven is. It's to just finally see well enough that you're there he is, right? There's God, and there's no looking away. And he's been there this whole time like that, right? But now we've been purified. It's not like God finally showed up.
Yeah.
It's that finally we've been purified to see what's always been there.
Yeah, man, may it be ubique totus, with Augustine's idea that God will be, well, I'm quoting 1 Corinthians 15, God will be all in all.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think that's actually really important. In philosophy of religion, the way divine hiddenness gets discussed is often in terms of propositional belief. So someone like Schellenberg will say, well, a good God wouldn't make it the case that people who are non-resistant would not believe. He would at least be evident to them such that and you need to believe someone exists per Schellenberg in order to love them. So he would at least give them that is kind of the crux of the argument. And Origen has been, and there are others who follow on Origen's footsteps, like Bernard of Clairvaux, and expositing the Song of Songs has been really helpful for me. Mm-hmm. They point out that in a fallen world, divine hiddenness, or the sort of ambiguity of the world, is conditioned by the fall. It's sort of what it's like to be in exile, but the bridegroom woos the soul. So in the Song of Songs, right, the lover, the bride, she is her affection for the bridegroom is inflamed by his absence.
Exactly.
And so God at times, he's not just trying to form cognitive belief in us. He's actually trying to forge a lasting love that engrafts us into Christ.
Yeah.
And as such might withdraw at certain times in order to kind of inflame love in our hearts and inflame this pursuit of Christ. And I think that would actually really help philosophy of religion to be more in dialogue with theology, namely that divine hiddenness is a function of the fall and is a function of the way that God is remedying fallen creatures and inflaming them at times with love for Christ.
Building a desire. I think. Exactly. And I mean, to your point, look, as much love as Adam and Eve before the fall have for God, the saints, by not having those preternatural gifts and by being inflamed by the loss or the perceived absence of God, and working through that, and receiving these experiences where you do feel God near at hand, but then all of a sudden he's away again, right? By working through all of that, now when they are with God, they have infinitely higher love and appreciation for God than Adam and Eve did, even in the preternatural state. That's really to say something important, I think.
Yeah. I agree. Well, I'll give some kind of closing thoughts, and if you want to add anything, you can feel free to. So I think, like, the way we're both thinking about evil here is that all of history, including evil, is underwritten by the providence of God. That doesn't mean that God is infusing evil or is generating evil in his creatures, but he does nevertheless permit creatures to act defectively. And he does this in order to bring about higher order goods, namely the display of the divine nature in particular ways. Now, that's not to say that we always know how the divine nature is displayed in a way that justifies the permission of a given evil. But we are given an icon of how that works out, namely in Christ, in his crucifixion, where the disciples are puzzled and they don't know how a good could come out of that would justify the crucifixion. And then Jesus is risen from the dead on the third day, and the cross is transfigured in its meaning. That's sort of an icon of how God will deal with every single evil, especially in the age to come, how he'll deal with every single evil. With natural evil as well, it's tending towards the good of the whole. God permits natural evil in order to bring about the display of the divine nature, whatever we think the source of natural evil is. And similarly, the permission of natural evils, including animal suffering, will tend towards this final resolution in which God is more clearly manifest than he would have otherwise been had those things had not been permitted. Did I miss anything?
That's beautiful. No, I think that you nailed you nailed it right on the head. That's great.
Great. Awesome. Well, great. Thank you so much for doing this. This is always a joy. Is there anything you'd like to pitch, any work that you're doing, or anything you want to mention to our viewers before we end the stream here?
Yeah, thanks for asking. No, I'm working on a book that's going to be dealing a lot with the free will defense and this particular argument for kind of solution to the problem of evil. And so I don't know, hopefully I'll finish that soon, but they maybe keep an eye out for it from CUA Press or something like that. That's probably where I'll submit it to. But other than that, just the book that I've already pitched. If they're interested in these kinds of conversations, along with your wonderful podcast, I will pitch the Sacra Doctrina Project as well. That's a community of scholars, theologians, philosophers, etc. We have a podcast called Sed Contra and a conference and numerous things like that. So they might find conversations there interesting as well.
Yeah, and I highly, highly encourage getting involved with the Sacra Doctrina Project. It's a wonderful group of people and scholars that love the Lord and take these things seriously and try to think through these things for the glory of God. All right, thanks so much. Go ahead and like and subscribe. God bless.